Hello everybody, and thank you very much to tuning in to Skate Spot Pod. Now, my name is Tim Finlay, and I'm a skateboard enthusiast, and I also have a love for history. And what I'm trying to do on this podcast is combine both of those things and hopefully reach like-minded individuals who find the same things interesting as myself. Now, this is my first podcast. This is my very first episode. So a really warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Grab a beer, grab a coffee, wherever you're at, and I hope you find this stuff interesting. So before I dive into the specifics of this first skate park, a little information about myself. My name is Tim Finlay. I'm 36 years old. I am originally from Australia, but for the last 7 years I've been living in Sweden. Now, this first episode is something that is quite personal for me because this park that I discovered actually reintroduced my love for writing and research, and it's taken me to places that I never thought that I would get to. It's really the sole reason that I came up with the idea to create this podcast. So I really wanted to start with this place because it really holds a little piece of sentimentality in my heart, and it's something that has really unveiled all of these interests and these things that I've loved doing that I really haven't done for many years. So my story really begins. It was just an average spring day. And when spring comes around in Sweden, you start to get pretty stoked because the weather gets warmer. You can actually skateboard or start to skateboard outside. For anybody who lives in colder climates, they dump like these really small rocks down on the grounds, kind of like an anti-slip mechanism. You really can't skateboard on the streets or do anything really. You've got to go to indoor parks, so it's super annoying. So during spring, they remove all these things. The leaves start to come out, birds are chirping, and it's a real period that you kind of get this pep for life, I guess. You feel like the winter's over. There's some hope now that the spring is coming around and eventually summer will be here. So it's one of these spring afternoons and I'm just on Google Maps trying to look for some cool skate spots. Now, I don't really like kind of the modern skating style. I've never been super good at it, but as a kid, I surfed a lot. So the surf skate style is something that I really prefer to do. And it's always like striking gold when you find a good ditch or you find a good bank, even a drain. It's kind of the perfect landscape to do carving, do turns, all those sorts of things. And that's what I was doing, just sort of scoping around on the west coast of Sweden on Google Maps and just trying to see if there was anything that stuck out. So after I'd burned 2.5 hours or something doing this, I managed to spot what looked like this big chunk of concrete. Now, there's a town on the southwest coast called Falkenberg, and it's not a huge town. It's more of sort of like a summer town. This is where this sort of pile of concrete was located. And it wasn't directly in the city of Falkenberg. It's a little bit outside in a town called Olofsbo. Now, my Swedish pronunciation is pretty bad. Let's say that again. Olofsbo. Yeah, it's pretty difficult. So I see this big chunk of concrete. And the funny thing was that it actually had like a pin, a Google pin. Now, from that pin, there wasn't that much information. It just said that it was a historical landmark. There was nothing else. There's no photos, nothing. So it's got my curiosity going. It was also a little bit strange because it was on kind of like a country property. There's a few sort of houses around it. It really looked like a junkyard because there was just sort of what we could make out, sheds and different things that are around it. But it looked a pretty decent size. I was just really curious about it. So before actually going down and checking it out for myself, I contacted a guy who lives down that way. And I just asked him, do you know what this is? Sent him through just a screenshot from my phone. And he got back to me super fast. And yeah, I was right. It actually is a skate park. And the funny thing is he said that it was actually a place where a lot of Swedish kids in the 70s and 80s learned how to skateboard. So for me, that was really cool because this must be a pretty iconic park and it's actually an old park, which is really, really cool. So now that it was verified that it was actually a park, I needed to go down and check it out for myself. And in the spring of 2021, that's exactly what I did. So I'm driving down there and I've got the coordinates locked in my phone and I'm getting closer and closer to the pin, and then there's sort of like a driveway. It looked like a private driveway. So the map's telling me I should drive in there. So I go into this driveway. And then when I arrive, there's 5 or 6 guys out the front doing some, I think it was yard work. I don't know. They were fucking digging something. They looked at me like super suspiciously, and I pull up. One guy comes over and he starts to talk to me. Now, this guy was actually the owner. he had acquired the property only around a year ago, and I think he was basically doing some preparations for wanting to do some expansion, I think build some apartments and things like that there. So he comes over and he's pretty friendly, and I just asked him, like, look, I've seen on the map that there's a skate park here, and I've just driven down from Gothenburg, and can I check it out and even skate it? And he said, yeah, look, that's fine. A few people come through here every now and then to check this place out. So I instantly was thinking, wow, this is something special here. He said to me that it's going to be pretty difficult to skate because it is full of water. So I was starting to get pretty disappointed at that point in time. But I was really, really curious. So he told me where to park my car. I got out of the car and I grabbed my skate deck. And like, it's super surreal. I don't know. I'm going to try as best as I can to explain what it felt like when I actually stumbled across this park, because it's something that's stuck in my mind for a long time, that first viewing of this place. So I got out of the car and then you go past, they almost look like farmers' sheds. And you go through there and they're like rusted and there's stuff everywhere. And then you start to see these sort of abandoned cars, there's caravans, there's all this sort of stuff. And then the first thing I actually spotted after getting through kind of the junk was this U-pipe. And it was just the frame. The U-pipe is just rusted. It's, got trees that are like growing over it and all these sorts of things. And that was the first thing that caught my eye. And then from looking at the U-pipe, I'm kind of like, my vision kind of steered away from that a bit. And then you get to this really, really dilapidated old set of stairs that go up to this boardwalk. So I go over to that and it's rotted. There's like beams missing out of the steps, and you're kind of just hoping that it doesn't fall through and all this sort of shit falls on top of you. But then once you're up there, you basically, the stairs take you to the boardwalk, and then the boardwalk overlooks this, it's just awesome, this old 70s style snake run. It's not huge, it's only 35 meters, but it is really deep. I don't know the specifics of the depth, but it's just not from this time. What's surrounding it is just bush. So it's just like real weeds, trees, and all these sorts of stuff. It just looks like, why is this thing here? It's so out of place. But the run is so iconic, and then you do have more of that like the traditional skate run that loops around, and then you've got kind of these transitions that are quite steep and quite sketchy. But the thing is at the center of the run, you've got this dip or this big gutter. It just almost looks like this big pothole that you kind of can roll into and then roll out with a lot of speed. It's just amazing. And my first vision of this was just, I don't know, it was like something off an Indiana Jones film. I'm like, fuck, why is it like this? And how is this place just fallen off the map when these old parks, there's not much of them left in the world, and it's just so fucking iconic. So after I'm taking all that in, I get really disappointed because it is, as the owner said, the whole thing is unskateable. It's completely engulfed in water. There's branches, there's mud, there's all this sort of stuff poking out. It looks like the fucking Loch Ness Monster's gonna come up and fucking snatch you when you start riding down into it. It's just an absolute mess. There's also huge cracks in the concrete, and the terrain is super rough. So I'm standing there and I'm thinking, it's amazing, but it's also looks like shit. And my mind's kind of racing, like, how has it been left to get to this point? So the owner comes back over. I don't know, he's just kind of checking up on me, I guess, because I am on his land. We just had a bit of a conversation around the park and all these sorts of things. And, he obviously understood some of its value. He said to me that he was at some point going to restore it, but you never know. If you're kind of not a skater yourself, it's a little bit hard to really take these sort of things in and see their value. And it's also on quite a big chunk of his land. So if he is doing development and all those sorts of things, I was feeling a little bit worried that maybe the owner could just kind of bulldoze it and this thing just disappears into oblivion. So knowing I couldn't skate it, I ended up just pulling out my phone and just taking some photos, taking some videos, just getting some evidence of this place, because I just had a feeling that its days were numbered. I didn't really know anything about the exact date of it or anything like that. I just know from the guy that I contacted that if kids were skating in the 70s, it's got to be a pretty old park and up there with some of these iconic parks from that era. Now, it would be a good idea to check out the links that I've provided in the pod description, because I think it's going to put into context exactly what this place looks like, and it's good for the audience just to check those out. So after taking some photos and taking some videos and having a chat with the owner, I got in the car and I drove back home. I didn't really do anything else about this place for at least, I'd say, a good 6 months. But this park was on my mind, like it was stuck in my memory. Every day I would think about it. I'd have the pictures and videos on my phone. And it sounds kind of corny, but it felt like this park was in some way just trying to like reach out to me or something. I don't know. I felt really connected to it and it just had this massive effect on me. So I'm kind of letting it mull over in my head for months and months and months. I just got so curious that I needed to really do some research and try and figure out as much about this place as I possibly could. So my first actions taken in doing research was just doing some basic searches. Now, the information that I had is that it was called Automobilen and it was a snake run. So quite obviously, I searched for those two things. There was a couple of results that popped up. The first one is a Swedish-based site. They have a whole bunch of different skate spots that they list throughout Sweden. And I guess the first thing that struck me from jumping on this site was the fact that it said it was the first commercial skate park to be built in Sweden. So right there and then I was like, shit, okay, this is super important. The second thing is that it actually mentioned that Tony Alva wrote it during his first European tour in 1978. So now I had this date of 1978 and I'm thinking, all right, that's still pretty old and that stacks up pretty well compared to some of the oldest parks still existing in the world. There's a couple of other images on this site as well. There was some more modern shots, I think, taken from early to mid 2000s of the park when it did look in much better shape than it does now. There was also some old pictures that were taken from newspapers as well. They weren't very, very clear. It was obviously black and white and you couldn't really see too much of the snake run itself, but there was a couple of those images circulating. Apart from that, there wasn't a great deal of other information. I jumped onto Instagram and also Facebook, and there is sporadically a couple of pictures that people have put up, but not much information around it. It was just kind of still pretty limited. So what I had the idea of doing then was actually getting onto Facebook and creating a group. So as I finished creating the group, I managed to find some old school skater groups. I joined those and basically just started posting the photos and videos that I found of the snake run in an attempt to get some interest and get some more information from some of the guys who were actually alive and skating in the 70s. And that actually had a really big impact, to be honest. So there was one guy who sent through some photos that his father had taken in 1979. Also him on the U-pipe as well. So there were some other photos that were sent through from the 1980s. I think it was around 85, 86. Then there is some content from sort of early 2000s up to 2010. And there's also some videos as well that are on YouTube. There's some guys casually skating it in the mid 2000s. And there's a clip on YouTube of the Swedish skateboarding championships that were held in 1997. And they were taking place at the Automobilen Snakerun. So apart from getting some great photos, I was actually sent through a link to an article. And this article was basically talking about the booming of skateboarding in the 1970s in Sweden. And this article was called The Betongvägen, or The Concrete Road. And this article was written by a Swedish guy called Gunnar Elmavik. So there's a brief paragraph in this article that mentions the Automobilen Snakerun. And I managed to get some really good information from this. So I got a date of when it was built, and that was 1978. There was also some other photos on that article as well, and there was one of the U-pipe. This was taken in 2011, and it was obviously in terrible shape then. You can see the kind of broken plexiglass that still existed at that point. When I checked it out, there was just a frame left. But it was great. I got to read a little bit more about the park. I've now got a specific date of when it was built. And from there I felt, okay, but let's just go and check out where this park actually stacks up against other parks throughout the world that still exist from this era. I naturally started just searching around in Europe, and the first thing that popped up was the ROM skate park in the UK. The thing that struck me was the fact that the ROM was actually built in 1978 as well. And the article was actually from a English newspaper stating that this park had gained a Grade 2 heritage listing, which means that it had been recognised as being a very historical landmark and was actually protected. So this was a real eye-opener for me because the ROM was built in the exact same year as the Snake Run. The ROM's been protected, it's been done up, people are still skating it to this day. Yet, a stone's throw away, there's another park in Sweden with this same type of significance that's just fucking rotting. It's just completely abandoned and forgotten. So the information that I pulled together from what I could find of these few sites and the media that I had pulled together from the Facebook group, I thought, let's try and have a bit of a stab in the dark here and contact a couple of skateboarding magazines that may take an interest to this. I got a really fast reply from Confusion Skateboarding magazine, and I got a response from the editor, Jonathan Hay, and he was really pumped and he thought it was a great idea. So that was super helpful, and I was just really grateful that somebody else thought it was a cool story. So knowing that Confusion was going to publish this in an article, it was real go time for me to dive into the research as hard as I possibly could, because I wanted to make this article bulletproof and also make it as interesting and show people why they should give a shit about this park. So the first place I actually started with my research was trying to find some old newspaper articles about the park. As I mentioned, there's very limited information online, so I thought that this could be the best way to try and put some of those pieces of the puzzle together and fill out the article as best I could. So I managed to find this online newspaper database, and this database was run by the King's Library in Stockholm. Now, when you're searching this database, it's a little bit difficult because you can't actually get the full article in front of you. You just put the keywords that you want in, and then you kind of get these little extracts. Those extracts will just mention parts of the sentence in which match the keywords that you search for. So I had to keep it pretty basic, and I was just searching for anything around skateboarding, the name Automobilen Snakerun, the location in Falkenberg. So the filters that you can use on this database are pretty good. I knew that it was built in 1978, so I just narrowed it down. So I'm kind of browsing through from this, and there wasn't that many results, which is a positive and a negative. I was thinking was actually a positive because I think I'd scrolled through about 2 or 3 pages, and then I actually got a hit. There was a small extract that I could see it was mentioning the location in Falkenberg, and it was mentioning actually Automobilen as well. And from what you can see, it gives you a hit to say that there's actually an image present. I know I had an image. I know that this had to be something that was talking about the Snake Run. So from that, you have to go through the process of ordering them. So you can order them in PDF format, and they come in about a week or so. I had a bit of delayed gratification. I couldn't get them instantly, which is a bit annoying. So while I'm waiting for these articles to be sent through to me, I got another hit coming from the Old School Skateboarders group on Facebook. And it mentioned that there was actually a guy who was making a documentary about the Snake Run. And this guy's name was Jonathan Löwander. So I got his contact details, and I just sent him an email and just basically asked him how he was going with the documentary, about the fact that I was also looking into the Snake Run because I went down there the previous year and I was super taken back by it and all these sorts of things. And Jonathan got back to me pretty fast. He was also pretty stoked that there was a little bit more interest generating. So we had a bit of a dialogue over email. I sent him through a whole bunch of stuff that I was looking into and also some of the images and things that I found. And he actually mentioned that there was a push to have the park listed as a historical landmark back in 2008. It was actually submitted on behalf of the same guy who wrote the article, The Concrete Road, that I mentioned earlier. His name was Gunnar Elmevik, and he submitted an application to the local council along with another Swedish guy called Lars Erik Jonsson. So what was surprising from what Jonathan said, the application was actually rejected. So the local council came up with this sort of bullshit excuse around that the park was way too dilapidated to be listed as a historical landmark. The whole reason it should be listed as a historical landmark is so that it can be protected and restored and it doesn't decay anymore. So it just seemed really convoluted and a bit of a bullshit response. So I was even more pissed off at that point, and the fact that the local council obviously didn't give two shits about it. So they'd be happy for it to kind of sit on private land and rot. And meanwhile, these councils are building other modern parks for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but for them to actually protect something from the 1970s that's this unique, and they won't do that. I thought it was just absolute rubbish. So after I'd had like a good amount of conversation with Jonathan, I managed to get the article sent through from the King's Library in Stockholm. Now this was really, really exciting. So they sent through a PDF that is the whole newspaper from where these articles existed. And scrolling through, not really seeing anything that's relevant. And then boom, there was this big article and this big picture of the Automobilen Snakerun. And the picture that's there is of an actual guy, and he's sort of sitting on the top of the snake run on more of a profile view. And behind him, there's a couple of kids that are doing some tricks. Now the little caption underneath said that this was the owner, and the owner's name was Uli Anderson. So now that I've actually got the name of the owner who built this thing, it felt like a few more pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit. So as I'm reading the article, it gave some really good information. Now the first thing that I read that was really surprising was the fact that the owner, he had no idea about skateboarding 2 weeks before he submitted an application for the building permit. There's also some other information in regards to where the park is located. So as I mentioned earlier, it's located just outside of a town called Falkenberg on the southwest coast of Sweden. But the place being called Automobilen, this isn't significant to the actual snake run. Automobilen is in reference to the fact that the property is originally a roadhouse, and it was a roadhouse when the skate park was built. And that wasn't actually the only thing it was. It was a nightclub, it was a go-kart track, and it was a whole bunch of other small little businesses. So it was kind of like this mismatch of different things, and the skate park was just another one of those compliments to the place, I guess. So knowing a little bit of history about the 1970s boom of skateboarding, I think there was a lot of people that were trying to cash in on the popularity of the sport. So I think that Uli probably knew that there was some money to be made in skateboarding, and he put this park together for the fact of charging admission and just trying to earn a couple of bucks. As I kept reading through the article, it mentioned that the park was going to be inaugurated the following week. And that was really interesting because then I could kind of piece together a bit of an estimate of when the park was opened. So the newspaper article was dated the 2nd of July, 1978. And this was actually a Sunday. So somewhere between the 3rd and the 9th of July, the park opened. Now, I've always been trying to keep searching for an actual article that mentions specifically the opening, just to try and get a bit of a timestamp, but as far as I know, there's nothing that exists. So it's in that window between the 3rd and the 9th of July 1978 when the park was open. So proving that the online database for the articles actually provided with a good hit, I jumped back on there and was really trying to find anything in reference to the opening, which I mentioned before I could never find. But what I did actually find was a few more articles that were written, and they weren't specifically talking about the snake run, but they were following Sweden's first skateboard team. And this skateboard team was called the Carter team. Now, the Carter team were down at the Automobilen Snakerun, kind of doing like some trials and testing on the place before it was actually opened. The article also mentioned the specific names of the people who were in the Carter skateboard team. And from there, I thought it would be a good point to try and reach out and contact these guys to see if they have any information about the park or they actually have any like original photos from them skating it. Now, there wasn't a huge amount of photos in this article, but there was a couple of small ones, and I thought that trying to get the originals for these would be amazing. So in Sweden, you can basically look up anybody's details online. So I had the names of these guys, and I roughly knew how old that they would be at this point in time. And what I found out, which is actually really sad, is that all of this team, except for one guy, have actually passed away. Now, the only existing survivor from the Carter team, he had his details online, and I just sent him through an actual text message because I thought that that would be maybe the most straightforward way to kind of approach him. And he was super responsive, and we started to kick off an email conversation, and he gave me some really, really great information. What I wasn't aware of was the Carter team actually helped Uli Anderson come up with the design. And this kind of makes sense because as Uli Anderson had no idea about skateboarding really, he needed to have people who were involved in the sport and knew what they were talking about. Some other interesting things were the fact that he mentioned that the park was built really, really quickly and the quality wasn't the best. So it started to deteriorate pretty fast. And what was funny is that I could actually see that from some of the 80s shots that were sent through on Facebook. You can start to see some of the cracks in the concrete, and it's starting to look a little bit sketchy even in the mid-80s. So the fact that he developed this thing pretty fast, and also him not really having much of a history of skateboarding, wasn't the best combination in the end. There was one day where I jumped on YouTube, and I don't know, I'd been on YouTube so many times before searching for the same keywords, but this time I got a different result and actually saw this one thing pop up. There was a video from a news channel in Sweden, and they were talking about the history of skateboarding down in Falkenberg, where the park is located. As I'm watching it, they're talking about some of the more modern parks that have been built in the last sort of like 10, 15 years. And then the last sort of 50 seconds or so, they actually start talking about the Automobilen Snakerun. From what I could see of some of the people interviewed, they didn't really speak very highly of the owner or of the actual park, to be honest. So at the last sort of like 15 seconds of the clip, they're talking to a museum curator, and there was some type of like exhibition that they held at the local museum down that way. What you can see behind her when she's being interviewed is there's actually like these old original photos from the Snakerun. And what was interesting is that some of these pictures are the ones that are being used in the newspaper articles that I found. So after seeing this, I knew I just had to track these down. I also got the museum's name, and it was a Cultural History Museum of Halland. Now, Halland is basically like the state of where Falkenberg is located. So I reached out to the Cultural Museum, and they said they didn't have any images, they didn't have any information about the Snakerun. So what I ended up doing was linking this video that I found on YouTube and saying that they had some type of exhibition there, but the exhibition was around in like 2010, 2011. So I was even skeptical whether or not these things had still existed. So I actually got one lady who finally reached out to me from the museum, and she found the images that we used in this exhibition. Now, there was tons of images, and they were all taken from the same day. And majority of these images I don't think have really ever been seen. From what I could see, it was just great. There was so many shots of the actual Carter team who were down there doing trials on the park, and this was definitely the most extensive photography collection that I know of the Snakerun that does exist. She also sent me the actual application that Gunnar and Lars submitted to the local council to try and get the Snakerun listed as a historical landmark. And this article was like a gold mine for me. And there were so many pieces of the puzzle that got put together after I read this application. So it says that the building permit was approved on the 20th of June. And now when I'd found that article talking about the opening, that was dated the 2nd of July, 1978. So between the 20th of June and the 2nd of July, he'd built this 35-meter concrete Snakerun, which is pretty fucking crazy if you think about it. And also the fact that this guy had no idea about skateboarding until 2 weeks before he sent in the application for it to be approved. It's nuts. And this also is probably a reason why it deteriorated so fast. There's also a little bit of information about the U-pipe too, and the U-pipe wasn't always located near the Snakerun. So the U-pipe was actually placed at the entrance to the roadhouse. And this was really some type of marketing stunt that Uli was trying to pull off. Now, where the skate park's actually located, it's actually on the old highway that used to link all the smaller towns from the bigger cities. So coming from Gothenburg all the way down to the third largest city in Sweden called Malmö. So obviously it being on a roadhouse is a good location for passers-by who are going to stop, they're going to gas up for fuel, maybe have a bite to eat, all those sorts of things. So Uli's probably thinking, okay, put the U-pipe there, we'll capture those people going on holidays or taking a trip down south, whatever it is, and they'll know that, oh wow, look, there's something to do with skateboarding here, and he can try and make as much money on as possible. But what ended up happening in the autumn of 1978 is that he actually had no permit for the U-pipe to stand where it was. So he had to move the thing, and he ended up placing it next to the snake run where it lived until it was actually completely removed in 2022. So that was a bit of an indication for me at that point. Time is really ticking for this park, and I was really scared that, hey, it may be the snake run that just disappears into oblivion next. So now that I'd scored all these images and also the original application that was submitted to the local council, I sent all this stuff through to Jonathan, and he was overwhelmed by the old pictures that I actually found. Now, I knew that he could use these in his documentary because they would just fit really, really well. So another few things that came about from some of my email conversations with Jonathan, there's had been people over the years that really had the snake run's best interest at heart. Apart from Gunnar and Lars, who were submitting the application to the local council, there was also a restoration plan that was drawn up for the snake run. And this restoration plan was drawn up by a company who operates down in Malmö, and they're called Bryggeriet. And the guy who's trying to push this restoration plan is called John Magnusson. Now, John Magnusson is a really influential Swedish skater, so I kind of had a real hope at that point, the fact that he was on the case and he had done the work to put a restoration plan together. Maybe there was some hope that this place was actually going to be restored, or some kind of arrangement could be put in place with the owners of the land to make sure that it's protected and it's going to be still standing for future generations. So I felt a little bit better after I knew that there had been some people that really cared about its value and had done as much as they possibly could to try and get this park just acknowledged and protected and up to the scratch of being skatable for everybody to enjoy. Now, all this sort of stuff is still ongoing with the restoration plan, and this is something that is going to be a part of the documentary that Jonathan will be pushing out during 2023. Roughly right now, it's looking like it's going to come out in the autumn of 2023, so you don't really want to miss this. It's going to be a really, really fantastic story. If we're going back to a bit more about the application, the fact that they saw it as being dilapidated is really just a small part of why this application was rejected. Now, getting some further information from Jonathan and just some people that he'd talked to when doing some interviews for the documentary, this park has had a real stigma that's been attached to it over the years. It's just been seen as a place that is quite sketchy. Quite obviously, the local council, they don't want to be associated with this place. Now, I was still set off on my path of getting recognition for the park. I put together a lot for my article. I put together the photos. I put together a whole bunch of research that I'd done. And that article is actually on the Confusion website. So the article's in the links below. So I really urge you to go and check that out and give it a read. It took me a great deal of time to put that together. And it is still the most extensive background, I guess, that you will find on the park anywhere online. Now, when the article was actually published, it got a pretty good response. So they pushed it out on social media. It's had some good amount of traffic and all those sorts of things. And there was also some more stories that came through. So when Confusion put that up on their Facebook page, there was a whole bunch of people that had skated it. So there was a whole bunch of people commenting that they had been there in the late 90s, early 2000s. Some people who had skated it back in the 1980s. So it kind of gave some fresh blood into the place and got people talking about it again. Now, when the article went live, we also got a whole bunch more people that would join the Facebook group. Now, there's also a link to the Facebook page in the description. So please check it out. It's a public group. You don't necessarily have to join, but if you really want to read what people are talking about the park and have a look at all the media that we pulled together, then please stop by. If you want to join, even better. The more people that we have in this community and the more people that can support the park is just a bonus for just helping the future of this place. The final mystery when it really came to this park was the whole Tony Alva story. Now, I didn't really know whether this was just sort of hearsay that was passed down from generation to generation. And I've seen it in 2 sites listed that he visited the park in 1978. So this is sort of even more credibility for the park. And if we could try and find something that could tie Tony Alva to it, whether it's a video, whether it's an image, anything at all, it would really help the overall cause and give this park just even more of a boost for its historical value. So I basically started scouring pictures on Pinterest, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere, from the old sort of iconic shots of TA. Now, as many of you will know, there was a specific photographer at that time, and he was called Win Miller, and he's taken most of the iconic shots of TA from the 1970s and 1980s. And Win Miller was actually the photographer that toured with Tony Alva during his first European tour in 1978. Now, what I found out is that he arrived in Stockholm when he came to Sweden. So after he did some demos and different things in Stockholm and some places north of Stockholm, he did make his way down to Gothenburg. Now, after he had spent some time in Gothenburg, it's rumor has it that he did go further south. Falcon Bay is around just over an hour south of Gothenburg. It was posted in the Facebook group and clarified that Tony Alva did skate it. Basically, he mentioned that he was just down at the Snakerun on an average day, and out of nowhere, Tony Alva just turns up and starts shredding it. I mean, that's pretty crazy, especially for being, late 70s, don't have social media, nothing like that, and you're just kind of there, and one of the famous and most iconic skater from that era just turns up at your local park and starts skating. It would have just been mind-blowing. Now, when I'm scouring the entire internet to try and find anything that actually resembles the Automobilen Snakerun, I couldn't come up with anything, and I'd seen so many videos of Tony Alva in Sweden during 1978, but they were more taken up Stockholm way. There's no documentation of him being in Gothenburg either. Couldn't find anything like that. So I was beginning to think that he probably did skate it, and these guys are telling the truth, but everything's lost. So the last kind of shot that I had was trying to pull together all the old skateboarding magazines from the 1970s that were published in Sweden. And there was a couple that came out at the time. There was one called the Skateboarding News. They only released 2 issues, so I thought that maybe they would be a good point to look at because they were both dated from 1978. I actually managed to find these 2 original magazines in the Humanitarian Library or the University Library of Gothenburg. So this was actually a bit of a story in itself because I went down there and I couldn't actually take the magazines home. Like, I had to sit in a reading room. But when I got into the reading room, they were like pristine. They were in this sort of plastic sleeve. And when I pulled both of these editions out, they looked like they hadn't been touched in almost 40 years. They were brand new. So just that in itself was amazing. I went through those 2 magazines just to try to find out if there was anything about Tony Alva or any documentation, and there's nothing there. There is a feature from Automobilen in one of the magazines, and that image I have actually seen circulating on the internet, and that was one of the first images that I did see when I was researching it. Basically, it's like a review of the Snakerun. A skate team went down there and they basically gave a review for the magazine, and the review wasn't great. They basically said it was a thumbs down to the Snakerun, the quality wasn't the best, and they were also talking about the fact that the U-pipe was really, really shitty, and they confirmed some of the stuff that the member of the Kata skate team had told me over email. Basically, that stigma that I was talking about with the park, it was still it was really building in the early days of skateboarding there, because a lot of the local kids and a lot of the magazines and skate teams, they didn't really want to be associated with the place. And I think the owner didn't really make it easy for people because he was trying to charge. There was also new parks that were free that were opening up in some of the bigger cities. So I think a lot of people just felt that park was a little bit off the beaten track and they may as well skate on their local parks in some of the bigger cities. So I think that's a real reason why this place just sort of fell off the grid, and quite quickly it just lost the attention and people were not interested in it basically. I managed to get a hit through the Facebook group again, and a group member actually posted a photo that was taken by Windmiller of Tony Alva doing kind of like a Burt slide at the top of this wooden ramp. When I looked into this image actually before it was posted in this group, because I went through so many different images of Tony Alva from the 70s, and there was a lot that was posted on Windmiller's Instagram account. This specific image, Windmiller's always credited it to being outside of Paris, but when it was posted in the group, I challenged the member who posted that, and he was hell-bent on the fact that this was not in Paris, that this was actually taken from the start of the old slalom run that existed at the Automobilen Snakerun. This image, I kind of was wanting to decode it, and what you can see from this image, which is very, very unique, is the fact that the slalom run that it's been quoted to being taken on, there's a whole tree line that runs all the way down. There's a kind of a white picket fence on each side, and then there is a traditional cottage on the left-hand side of this image, and that cottage is really monumental to actually tying the evidence together that this picture was actually taken at the Snakerun in Falkenberg, and it's not taken outside Paris. So what I did, I jumped on Google Maps and I went to Street View and put myself at the front of the roadhouse. Now, these traditional cottages, they still exist on the land. And I had to work some different angles on Street View just to kind of line it up. And boom, it is clear as day that that cottage on the left-hand side of the photo is the one that's represented in this shot by Windmiller. So the chimney's exactly the same. There's sort of these intricate kind of woodworkings on the sort of A-frame of the house. You can see that there's like a wooden skirting board that runs around the more of the white exterior of the cottage. It is really, really, really uncannily, unmistakably taken at Automobilen. The other part which has even more evidence for this shot is the actual tree line, and that run still exists. So for me, it was 100% evidence that this very, very iconic shot that's been circulating for so many years is actually from Automobilen. And again, it just ties together the unlucky circumstances that this park has fallen into, and it couldn't even have been properly credited by Windmiller to being taken there. It feels like it's just been failed on so many levels. That's something that I wanted to clear up, and I really wanted to have this attributed to Automobilen. I also got an old photo that was sent through of the slalom run. It's not the exact same angle that was taken from that shot of Alva, but it is very, very similar. The ramp's the same, the white picket fence is the same, you can see the same type of tree lines, and the evidence is just overwhelming that this shot was taken at Automobilen, not taken in France. So as it stands today, it is still a very, very fragile set of circumstances. The park still exists. It is obviously on private land, and the owners haven't tried to remove it yet. So there's a lot of things here that are still flying in the air right now, but exposure, getting people talking about it, getting it recognized for its heritage, having it circulate in social media, having the documentary come out next year are really, very important. It deserves credit. And at the end of the day, it's just a very, very mystical, cool place that should be protected for future generations to skate. There's already so many memories and so many stories attached to this park. It would just be a travesty if one day it was demolished and it was wiped from the skateboarding world. I would love to hear your thoughts about my first podcast. If you have any further questions about the Snakerun or anything in general about wanting to help the situation and the cause, please send them through to our Facebook page, which is Surf Skate Sweden. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you really enjoyed this first installment of Skate Spot Pod. I'm going to try and drop a new podcast quite frequently. So I think that there is so many other parks in the world that are either still existing or extinct that have so much history and value to skateboarding in general that I want to know more about, and I also want to showcase them to people who are interested in them. So make sure you subscribe to this podcast. I really look forward to releasing a new episode. Thanks a lot, guys.